Welcome back to the FantasyPros YouTube channel. My name is Derek Brown, and on today's video, we're going to talk about 8 players that ECR and you should be higher on for Week 15. Before we get to these players, all the analysis for this video comes from the primer, so head over to FantasyPros.com, check out the primer right now. Let's talk about these players. All right, first guy up here on the docket has to be Jameis Winston, coming in at QB 16 in FantasyPros ECR. And what have we seen out of Jameis? Outside of doing Jameis things since he's been Cleveland's starter, this team has leaned into the passing game, and that has helped fuel with the big plays for Jameis to be a QB1 in 4 of his 6 starts. And the ceiling's been high, people. Like, he's got a QB1 overall week. So if you need the ceiling and the upside this week, you need to consider Jameis Winston for your starting lineups. And this has not been a good Kansas City pass defense for the last few weeks, having corner issues outside of Trent McDuffie, and it showed up on the field, people. Since week 9, the Kansas City Chiefs have allowed the 12th highest yards per attempt and the 8th most passing touchdowns. Jameis Winston could light them up in week 15. If he does so, he's going to be a QB1 this week. All right, moving away from quarterbacks over to the tight end realm, and I'm going to talk about everybody's tight end streamer du jour of this week. And yes, we are going to discuss Stone Smart. No, this is not just me rolling back, okay, the next Chargers tight end up. This comes down to matchup. This comes down to what we saw out of Smart last week. And look, he could be a tight end 1 this week. Last week in the second half, after losing Will Dissly, he had a 73.3% route share, a 25% target share, almost 5 yards per route run. Do I expect him to continue those ludicrous numbers outside of the route share? No. Does that mean that he cannot be a tight end 1 this week? Again, no. He can finish as a top 12 option. The Bucs pass defense has been terrible at guarding tight ends. They're allowing the 2nd most receiving yards per game and the 7th most schedule adjusted fantasy points per game to the position. Ladd McConkey, even if he plays, is still not 100%. You need to consider Stone Smart for your lineups for week 15. Okay, moving away from quarterbacks and tight ends, let's talk about a running back this week that you need to consider for an RB2 or a flex play. And I've got to mention Isaiah Davis. And everybody that started Braylon Allen last week is watching Isaiah Davis get carries and saying, I thought I was getting a workhorse. I thought this is why I held on to Braylon Allen. And what is going on here? Isaiah Davis is a talented running back, and he carved out a role in this backfield. Last week, played 52% of the snaps overall, had a 75% snap rate when the team got in the red zone. He had 13 touches and 67 total yards. He finishes the RB15 for last week. So yes, let's put some respect on Isaiah Davis's name, as well as on a per touch basis. And I know we don't have a large sample to work with here, people, but Davis has been good. 6.7% explosive run rate, 20% missed tackle rate. Those numbers play up all day. Now you marry all of this, not outside of role and talent, with the matchup. Since week 9, Jacksonville has allowed the 2nd most rushing yards per game and the 4th highest rushing success rate. Isaiah Davis could be an RB2 again this week. Hope you picked him up off the waiver wire. You need to start him this week. All right, now let's crack open all the wide receivers we need to discuss this week that need to be in your lineups. And the first guy I'm going to mention here is Adam Thielen. The old man's getting it done, people. Over the last 2 weeks, he has had a 26.3% target share, 2.72 yards per route run, and almost a 32% first read share as the clear wide receiver 1 for the Carolina Panthers. And yes, Bryce Young's playing better. The other thing we've seen out of Thielen, those 2 weeks, wide receiver 6 for the week, wide receiver 17 for the week. And a lot of spots, you're playing him as a flex play or a wide receiver 3. That's awesome. Looking especially at the matchup this week, Dallas can't stop slot wide receivers. Since week 9, they're giving up the 5th most fantasy points per game to the position and the 6th highest PPR points per target. Adam Thielen needs to be in your lineups for week 15 if you want to advance to week 16. All right, before we break into the top 4 players on this week's list, if you are juggling multiple fantasy football playoff teams and still feeling a little bit overwhelmed, FantasyPros is here to help you simplify things, people, with the FantasyPros Multi-League Assistant. You can see the latest news, notes, and rankings for every single player across all of your playoff squads. It's all in one spot, making your path to victory and championships clearer, and easier. Dive in and let us help you today to dominate all of your leagues with the multi-league assistant at fantasypros.com/myplaybook or on the Fantasy Football My Playbook app. Download it today. All right, to the top 4 wide receivers for Week 15. On this week's video, we got to talk about Ray McCloud. And yes, we're going to just roll this back, people. We have been targeting slot wide receivers versus the Las Vegas Raiders, and I'm not going to stop it this week. And that leads us to Ray McCloud, who's on a heater. Over the last 2 weeks, he is averaging 14.7 PPR points per game, 6 receptions, and almost 97 receiving yards, and the heater continues this week. Since week 9, the Las Vegas Raiders cannot defend slot wide receivers well. They're allowing the 5th highest PPR points per target to the position. Ray McCloud is coming in at wide receiver 53 in ECR. That's blasphemous. Pump those numbers up, people. Let's get him up the ranks because he needs to be in your lineups. Continuing with the theme. Slot receivers, slot receivers, slot receivers. All of them are scoring points this week, and the next one we're going to discuss this week is Elijah Moore. Wide receiver 45 in ECR and FantasyPros.com since week 8. Yes, he's been the wide receiver 43 in fantasy points per game. I know that's not great, but in that sample, he has 3 top 24 finishes in weekly scoring. Wide receiver 22, wide receiver 14, and wide receiver 15. If he pulls that off this week, you will be glad that you started him. And he could do it. Again, we're talking about pass defenses that cannot stop slot receivers. Well, guess what? The Kansas City Chiefs fit the bill here. Since week 9, allowing the most receiving yards per game to the position and the 9th highest PPR points per target. Get Elijah Moore into your flex spots in your lineups and teaming with Jameis Winston for Week 15. Okay, I promise the last 2 guys are not going to both be slot wide receivers for this list, but one of them will be. Got to talk about Keenan Allen, wide receiver 39 in ECR, and the last time that he faced this secondary for the Vikings, he was the wide receiver 5 for the week because the Vikings have struggled against inside receivers all year. Since week 9, drilling it down, the 11th most receiving yards per game to the position and the 2nd most receptions. Keenan Allen is going to eat again in week 15. Okay, to the number 1 player we have to discuss for this week, DeAndre Hopkins as a wide receiver 37 in the rankings on Fantasy Pros right now is a slap in the face of DeAndre Hopkins. He has been, since week 9, the wide receiver 24 in fantasy points per game, and I am predicting, look, if you follow me last week and you bet the ladders for Amari Cooper on bettingpros.com, please follow me down this well again this week for DeAndre Hopkins. Ladder it up, people. We're climbing high this week because I think DeAndre is going to have a huge game. I talked about 2 Cleveland Browns players. I think this game against the Chiefs is a shootout this week. I think Jameis Winston pushes the Chiefs to throw, to play fast, and we're going to see it. And if that all happens and that comes to fruition, DeAndre Hopkins is going to crush. A lot of this comes down to not only just the coverage matchup, but what we've seen out of the Browns the last few weeks. DeAndre has been awesome with the Chiefs versus single high. We know that the Cleveland Browns run this a ton. They're the 3rd highest rate of single high in the NFL. DeAndre Hopkins, since week 9 against single high, almost a 22% target share, 2.73 yards per route run, and a 25.9% first read share. That's wide receiver 1 type of usage, volume, efficiency, all the way around. And you marry that with the Cleveland Browns, not only is it the single high, they have struggled to stop deep passing. Since week 9, Cleveland has allowed the most deep passing yards per game and the 9th highest CPOE to deep passing. You're going to say, wow, why not Xavier Worthy? Well, guess what? Since week 9, it's not Xavier Worthy leading this team in deep targets. That is DeAndre Hopkins that is leading the team in deep targets. So he is playing better than people realize. We have coverage matchup leans in DeAndre's way, and as well as the deep passing role and the matchup for DeAndre Hopkins. He's going to smash in week 15. You need to start him. The ceiling is high. He's going to be awesome, people. Please get him into your lineups. All right, everyone, that is the top 8 players you need to be considering for your lineups. Again, look, head to FantasyPros.com, read the primer, use the multi-league assistant, help us help you to win your fantasy football matchups this week, get to week 16, one step closer to those fantasy championships. I'll see you in week 16. Good luck.